Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so the second part of the conclusion, second part of 3 videos we are going to need to work through the conclusion. I've broken this video up into 2 parts, ideas and repetition. Ideas will take up almost the whole video. Repetition just comes in at the very end with a quick kind of recap of what we've talked about in the body of the book. And I think we'll continue with repetition a little bit into the last video as well. But anyway, the first part, ideas. So one of the biggest things to keep in mind with ideas for Deleuze is that they're not mental. This is not just, it's not like something that we're thinking of. It's not something that requires a conscious being to think of. It's not that kind of idea. And with that said, he's really taking on, he's adopting this this whole framework of ideas and thought and reason and all those words that we associate with ideas. He's taking the whole thing on board. So when he talks about selves, for example, again, we think of that as something internal, something mental maybe, but it all has to be understood within this framework that Deleuze is presenting, where ideas aren't those kinds of ideas. They're not mental. So he doesn't say it explicitly, but the only way this makes sense to me is to think of these as metaphysical. They're not thoughts, they're not cognitive or intellectual in any way. They are the way reality is, such that anything can be actualized, such that any kind of concrete reality can come to be. And that for me is a perfect description of metaphysics. And one of the biggest ways to think of this, one of the biggest hints, I guess, that this is where we're going with ideas into the realm of metaphysics, is the way that Deleuze talks about the biological idea, which is, it's not a theory or an idea about how biology works. It's not scientific or anything. It's the way that species and individual organisms come into being. And they come into being from this Deleuzian biological idea. And that's what I mean when I say this is metaphysical. It's how concrete realities come to be actualized. So an idea is a multiplicity constituted of 3 things: differential elements, differential relations between those elements, and singularities corresponding to those relations. So that's a really tidy, kind of big picture way to think of ideas. And he also talks about 3 aspects of multiple reason, which are associated with those 3 dimensions that I just mentioned. The first aspect of multiple reason, determinability, or the principle of quantitability. The second is reciprocal determination, or the principle of qualitability. And the third is complete determination, or the principle of potentiality. And the thing with this is there's not like a one-to-one correlation here between the 3 aspects of multiple reason and those 3 features I mentioned before. It's more like the 3 aspects, the second 3 aspects are kind of what ideas are doing. They are, an idea is essentially a system in which, and it's a virtual system, or it's perhaps better, it's a system comprised of a virtual multiplicity. So it's 100% indeterminate. Anything can arise out of this. There's nothing, no actual thing there at the beginning, but through the differential elements, the relations, and the singularities, the indeterminateness of this virtual multiplicity becomes something determinate. And that's what the three aspects of multiple reason kind of depict, the way that ideas take this an originally indeterminate thing and derive something determinate from it. And also it's worth noting why he calls this the three aspects of multiple reason. Reason again being connected with the kind of the leading, I guess it's a metaphor. I guess it's a metaphor, the metaphor of ideas. So with ideas we think about thinking, thought, reason, those kinds of things, selves, the I. And so when he says multiple reason, he doesn't mean reason in the way that we normally mean it. He means as associated with his appropriating of the metaphor of ideas. So it's reason, if you think about it in the normal way we use the word, is something like the way that ideas kind of work through in a logical fashion to get to some result. And that's exactly what these three aspects do: determinability, reciprocal determination, and complete determination. It's describing the process of going from that indeterminateness to determination. And so the metaphor just fits in there. So I quite like that. I'm not usually a big fan of changing the way that we use words or using words in strange ways, but I think he has to use something. Deleuze has to use some kind of word to describe these metaphysical systems, and ideas is a good one. It does have a little bit of traditional support through Kant in particular, and just continuing the metaphor, I think, with reason, with selves, with this kind of language that Deleuze uses. I think it's good, but you just have to be aware that that's what's happening, that he is using these words in a very different way than the way that we normally do. And so this interplay that is taking place within ideas, Deleuze calls the differential in the idea. And that's pretty much it. I did also note, although we've talked about this already, there's nothing fixed or actual about ideas. Ideas aren't any particular thing. They're not static at all. They're not, but that's the thing, they're not actually anything at all. They're indeterminate. That's the whole point behind calling them a pure virtuality. They're nothing. Even the elements themselves within the idea don't crystallize into anything until there is that reciprocal determination, which brings about, which causes the elements themselves to emerge as elements. So that's broadly what ideas are. And now we're just going to break down some of the different parts that make up ideas. So the first one we're going to look at is incarnation and actualisation. So ideas become actual in two steps, Deleuze says. The first is they're incarnated in fields of individuation. So he says the intensive series of individuating factors envelop ideal singularities which are in themselves pre-individual. So that's incarnation. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then actualisation. The ideas are actualized into species and parts. And I'll give you a quote for this. Ideas are actualized in species and parts, qualities and extensities, which cover and develop these fields of individuation. A species is made up of differential relations between genes, just as the organic parts and the extensity of a body are made up of actualized pre-individual singularities. However, the absolute condition of non-resemblance must be emphasized. Neither species nor qualities resemble the differential relations that they actualize, any more than the organic parts resemble the singularities. The possible and the real resemble one another, but not the virtual and the actual. The incarnation and the actualization of ideas no more rely upon similarity or proceed by resemblance than ideas themselves possess a given identity or may be assimilated to the identical. So that's actually a really good summary, I think, of actualization. Again, this whole chapter, this conclusion, is so good for summarizing, but you have to have read the book itself. It makes no sense. If you just jump into the summary, to the conclusion, it won't mean anything really. But having gone through the whole book like we have, that chapter, that quote just captures pretty much everything you need to know about actualization, I think. There is one issue here with the word incarnation, however. If you remember when we discussed incarnation in, I think it was chapter 4, we talked about the way that incarnation differs from actualization. We said that the varieties of relations are actualized in qualities or species, and the singular points are incarnated in number or distinct parts. But both actualization and incarnation moved from the idea, differentiation, into the actualized concrete reality, differenciation with a C. And here, in the conclusion, he's talking about something slightly different. Incarnation doesn't take us from the idea to the concrete reality. Incarnation is taking place within the idea. It's the way that, as I said, the intensive series of individuating factors envelop ideal singularities, which are in themselves pre-individual. So it's kind of the beginning of that process of actualization. And then actualization itself carries the process from the idea into concrete reality, into into species and parts, qualities and extensities. So there are two different ways of thinking about incarnation, or two different ways that incarnation's been described as far as I can see. It's not a big thing, and incarnation's not a central part of Deleuze's philosophy, but yeah, it's just a funny thing, I think, that it is getting, as far as I can tell, it's being described in two different ways here, slightly different ways, but just something to be aware of. I saw it and I couldn't reconcile it, so I thought I'd mention it. But okay, so let's look at that quote then, see what we have here. We're talking about the idea, a biological idea. So species are, the species is the actualized differential relations between genes. That's when within the idea, those relations between the genes, when they actualize as species. And this is something like the general template for the organism. That's how I think of it anyway. It gives the broad outlines. And then the organic parts, the body, are actualized singularities. And that's the two halves of actualization. Because when an idea is actualized, it's actualized into species or qualities and parts or extensities. And those two, the species or the qualities, are the more general template, and the parts and extensities are the actual the actual organism itself, the body, the specifics, if you like, of the process of actualization, the physical specifics. So those are the two halves of actualization. And incarnation is the way that I read it here. It's happening prior to this. It's happening within the idea as the intensive series of factors envelops the singularities. And then they all get actualized in those two lines, species and parts. The other thing that was important in that quote is the non-resemblance between differential relations and the differential relations and the species, which are eventually actualized, and the singularities and the parts, which are eventually actualized. Non-resemblance between those two. That again is, everything's about difference. There's difference at every stage in this process. And this in particular is important because Deleuze uses this to distinguish between the possible and the virtual. So the possible and the real, that's the opposite of the possible. The possible and the real resemble each other. If something's possible, it's like a conceptual idea. It's a representation. It's part of representation. And the whatever it is that you're thinking of, whatever idea, that's not the word to use, whatever concept you have that exists as possible, if it ever becomes realized, it must resemble the original concept, the original possible. But when a virtual idea is actualized, when the virtual becomes actual, those two things don't resemble each other. They are completely different in kind. And so we have something like the genes, for example, genes within that make up the elements within the biological idea. They don't have any kind of resemblance. They don't bear any kind of resemblance at all to the traits which they will eventually lead to, which they will eventually be actualized as. And so that's kind of the point. You're getting something completely different from what you started with. And that's how Deleuze thinks about this. The virtual is, there's no trace of resemblance between the virtual and the actual, whereas there is between the possible and the real. Okay, so let's leave incarnation and actualization and move into differentiation and differenciation. So with a T and with a C. Differentiation is the way that ideas are determined in the virtual. In this sense, the virtual is by no means a vague notion, but one which possesses full objective reality. It cannot be confused with the possible, which lacks reality. As a result, whereas the possible is the mode of identity of concepts within representation, the virtual is the modality of the differential at the heart of ideas. So this is taking that idea, of distinguishing between the virtual and the possible a little bit further. The virtual is fully real. It's real in every sense of that word, even though it's virtual. It hasn't been actualized, but it's real. It's not abstract. That's the idea. It's not just a concept. It's fully real. And again, the word metaphysical comes to mind here. That it's metaphysically real. It's not just a concept, an abstraction. Whereas the possible is the exact opposite. It's not real. It is just an abstract concept, a representation. And when it becomes, when it is turned into something tangible, when it becomes something not just in the mind, if you like, not just a concept, then it's not actualized, then it becomes real. So it's realized. So you have the transition from the virtual to the actual, fully real in both cases, compared to the possible and the real. And only one of those, the latter, is real. The possible is not real then. And so the other thing I wanted to mention here is the possible is the mode of identity of concepts and representation, because the concept is what it is. It's fixed. It's fixed as the thing that it is, so that there's identity there. And if we didn't have that identity, it wouldn't be anything. There'd be literally nothing there. There'd be no possible at all. So there'd be no concept. So it has the mode of identity as a concept. And when it's realized in a way which exactly resembles that concept. So you have identity and resemblance involved in this process. And that's that representation side of the divide for Deleuze. Whereas with the virtual is the modality of the differential in ideas. So again, difference as opposed to identity. And nothing is brought into being. Nothing, and it is nothing until it's brought into being by being determined in the idea and actualized in concrete reality. So there's no, and when it is actualized, it's actualized as something completely different from what it was within the idea. So there's just no trace of identity or resemblance with the virtual. And we kind of drifted off what differentiation is, but that's what differentiation is, the way these ideas get determined within this virtual multiplicity. And it actually kind of ties into Incarnation a little bit, because it's what happens right before Incarnation, where the singularities are enveloped and then actualized. So it's if you remember those three aspects of multiple reason: determinability, reciprocal determination, complete determination. Complete determination is where you have the elements. You have elements existing and existing in relation to each other within the idea. Things that have condensed into those singularities, and that's what differentiation is. That's what this process is that Deleuze is calling differentiation. It's the way that those three aspects of multiple reason work within the idea to generate these singularities, to produce something that is completely determined. And then Incarnation takes over. Those singularities are enveloped through intensity, and then actualization, the process of actualization. And actualization is essentially just differentiation with a C. The way that those enveloped singularities are then developed into concrete reality. And the reason he called it differentiation is because it's actualized. The idea is actualized in different lines, or can be actualized in different lines. And when it's actualized in one line, then it's different from any of the other lines. And he uses the word with a C, differentiation with a C, because just to distinguish it from differentiation with a T, which is happening within the idea. That's the process of determining those singularities in the first place, that will be eventually differentiated with a C. Okay, so let's have a look at distinctness and clarity as well. And distinctness here is Deleuze says, the state of a completely differentiated idea. So it's within the idea, it's within this system of virtual multiplicities. And clarity is the forms of quantitative and qualitative differentiation with a C. So it's on the actualized side of the divide. So with those definitions in mind, distinctness is something related to the idea. Clarity is something related to the actualized reality. Then ideas, rather than being clear and distinct, which is the Cartesian model of certainty, instead of that we have this notion of distinct obscure. That's the way Deleuze describes this, distinct obscure. Ideas as they exist in themselves are distinct obscure. Opposed to the clear and distinct of Apollonian representation, ideas are Dionysian, existing in an obscure zone which they themselves preserve and maintain, in an indifferentiation which is nevertheless perfectly differentiated, in a pre-individuality which is nevertheless singular. So first, nice Nietzschean reference there with Apollo and Dionysus, those two, the Apollo being the model of representation and kind of well organized and ordered and logical, neat, and Dionysus being the chaos, the kind of debauchery and rampant disorder that Nietzsche saw as being the way to describe reality itself. So that's cool. And also, the main idea with that, though, ideas can never be clear and distinct. So this idea, this belief that ideas can be clear and distinct only holds within representation if you hold to the model of representation. But if you want to know the reality itself, not the representation, not the model, if you want to know reality itself, this is never clear and distinct. And it's because clarity and distinctness are on opposite sides of individuation here. The more distinct the idea is as being differentiated, the less clear it is as differentiation, because it hasn't been differentiated yet. Whereas the opposite holds true. If the clearer you have, the clearer the picture you have of the concrete reality, the less distinct the idea is, because this is covered over now by the concrete reality. And it is kind of tricky to grasp this, because it's not about knowing it. Obviously, if we're just talking about the way that we can know these things, we can know both. Obviously, we can know the biological idea, we've been talking about that, and we can know the concrete reality because we've been talking about that as well. But it's not about knowledge here. Deleuze is not talking about intellectual knowledge. He's talking about what these things are as metaphysical realities, going beyond epistemology to looking at what these things are as actual things. And the idea, when it is an idea, completely differentiated, it hasn't been actualized yet. So it is there as in this complete determination, the state of complete determination, but it hasn't been actualized. So it's perfectly distinct, but there's no clarity because it hasn't been actualized yet. Whereas if the opposite holds true, it's been actualized, then it's perfectly clear, but the idea from which it was actualized is now distinct because it's been covered over, it's been lost with the actualization. So it's not about if you step back from this and look on it as a kind of a third person, from a third person perspective, then yeah, we can know both, obviously. But Deleuze is talking about not knowing, not that kind of, not knowledge in that sense of the word, but knowing in this metaphysical sense, in what the idea itself is. The idea is distinct if it's differentiated, and it's clear if it's differentiated. And so, again, it's the moving from the third person view as a spectator to understanding the situation from the idea itself, the perspective of the idea itself, the system that is this virtual multiplicity. And I think once you have that clear, then this what Deleuze is talking about with distinct obscure now becomes clearer. And that overcomes this potential objection as well, that this is just a semantic issue. He's defining the words distinct and clear in such a way that you can never have both at the same time. True, he is defining the words in that way, but he's defining the words in that way because they reveal a metaphysical truth. They reveal something true about the ideas themselves, not the view of the spectator looking down upon them, judging them, analyzing them with these ideas with the forms that we bring to reality when we look at it and judge it and fit it into models. That's the whole representation approach. Deleuze is looking at it, and this is actually something Bergson said too, looking at intuition. He called it. Intuition is trying to grasp reality from the inside, the way that reality itself is, not the way it appears to us when we step back and look at it. And that's exactly what's going on here. I don't know. I hope that makes sense. It's an interesting idea, and that there is a lot to talk about, more to talk about this than I realized. Actually, distinctness and clarity. It just kind of opened up. The bottom opened up underneath me as I was talking about it, and we drifted down the rabbit hole. But hopefully that makes some sense. It's an interesting distinction that Deleuze makes there. Anyway, let's leave that and move on to problems. So problems, again, if we're talking about problems in the realm of ideas, they're not subjective. So it's not a problem for a mind. It's not a cognitive thing or an intellectual thing. And problems are not provisional either. And when Deleuze says provisional, I think he's meaning something like incomplete or unfinished, or like an intermediate stage on the way to a solution. Problems are not those kinds of things. They're not subjective, they're not provisional. The problematic is a state of the world, a dimension of the system, and even its horizon or its home. It designates precisely the objectivity of ideas, the reality of the virtual. The problem as problem is completely determined, to the extent that it is related to its perfectly positive conditions. It is necessarily differentiated, even though it may not yet be solved, and thereby remains undifferentiated. The problem is solved once it is posited and determined, but still objectively persists in the solutions to which it gives rise and from which it differs in kind. So let's just step by step work through that. Problem is a state of the world. The problematic is a state of the world. So again, the way I would describe this, metaphysical. We're talking about reality itself. Reality is problems. Before there are any particular things, reality has to, in order for there to be things, reality has to have this differential, problematic nature. The problem is completely determined, so pure positivity, and that's to say that it is differentiated but not differentiated. So completely determined within the idea, but it hasn't been differentiated yet. Solutions appear in the actualization and differentiation, but the problem never disappears. And that's important, because the problematic is, it's not a specific thing. It's not like a mathematical problem that you need to solve, and once it's solved, it's no longer a problem. The problematic is always retained for Deleuze, because again, that's metaphysical reality. It's the way the world is. It's the way the world is. If it were any different, the world couldn't be what it is. There would be no world. And this really testifies to the fertility that's inherent in Deleuzian ideas and genuine thinking. And this is what I like in Deleuze, I have to say. He approaches these topics from an unconventional direction, using language in a way that really opens up new insights, I think. So yeah, cool. And finally, again, the idea, problems differ in kind from solutions. Resemblance is out. There's no trace of resemblance here. Problems, when they are solved, the solution is completely different. And we're talking about, again, differentiation. So it's that same process, the way that ideas go from that indeterminate state to being determined, to then being actualized. Okay, so the next little section I wanted to cover is the origin of ideas. And Deleuze talks about this using the metaphor of a game, but a divine game as opposed to a human game. And I'll just give you the details of both, and we'll see how this ties in with difference for him. So human games presuppose pre-existing categorical rules, and these rules serve to determine the probabilities, in other words, the winning and losing hypotheses. So human games have these pre-existing rules, and they give us the probabilities. They define the territory, if you like, within which the game is going to proceed. Therefore, they never affirm the whole of chance, is the way that Deleuze puts it. They never affirm the whole of chance, because the consequences of prior throws, he's talking about dice, by the way, I didn't mention that, throws of the dice, consequences of those prior throws are excluded or restricted based on the rules. So whatever you roll in the past, that influences or restricts or determines in some way what is going to be, what can happen with the next throw. And the way that Deleuze expresses this, he says chance is thus fragmented. So it's broken up, it's parceled out according to the rule. They proceed, he says, by sedentary distributions. And by this, he means that the categorical rule functions as the same, with a capital S, the same, thus enjoying a kind of metaphysical or moral necessity. So that's kind of an interesting, a nice phrase too, sedentary distributions. So you have this fixed sameness which underlies the whole game. And he says that this is the game of the hypothetical and the categorical. So hypothetical in the sense that it's possible, so back to this idea of abstraction, not real, and the categorical, which is a reference, I think, to the anchor of the same, that sameness that undergirds the whole game. So the same and representation, that's what characterizes human games. And the example he gives is Pascal's wager. And the problem with Pascal's wager, the idea that, we think about, is there a God? If there is, and I choose not to believe, what do I get for that? And if there is, and I choose to believe, what do I get? And the other way, if there is no God and I choose to believe, what happens? If there is no God and I don't believe, what are my outcomes? So it's Pascal's wager then fragments chance. It breaks it up into these different portions under the constant rule of the existence of God. That's what underlies the game. And then we just go through and we can parcel out results. We can compare them. Chance has been fragmented in this way for Deleuze. And it's all based on limitation and negativity, a relation between these different outcomes, and that the outcomes hold only because they're tethered to this original fixed sameness of the rule, that whether God exists or not. And you can see just the outcome is this outcome only in relation to another outcome, which it isn't. So it's all operating under the model of limitation and negativity. The divine game, on the other hand, here there is no pre-existent rule because the game includes its own rules. In fact, he says each throw invents its own rules. And this is a reference to the pure virtuality of the elements, relations, and singularities in the idea. There is no rule. Every throw, keeping the metaphor going, every throw creates a new rule. So there's no restriction on what can come about, what can be actualized. Thus, nothing is exempt from the game. Consequences are not subtracted from chance. So the exact opposite of what we said regarding the human game, right, where they never affirm the whole of chance because there's always this throw. My current throw is always influenced by the throw that came before according to those pre-existing categorical rules. But with the divine game, nothing is exempt. Every throw is open to the endless, limitless potentialities of chance. It's not chance. It's not like any throw can produce anything, but it's that there's always the scope for something new to arise. So it's not fixed in that sense. There's always possibility. Although possibility has a bit of a negative association with Deleuze, there's always potentiality, maybe is better. And that's kind of the way Deleuze thinks too, right? You can see it in the way he forms his own ideas. He takes he takes the original idea, but finds different ways of combining relations within the idea, within in relation. He finds different relations within different parts of the idea to produce something genuinely novel, but something genuinely useful or interesting as well, I think. So that's the way he thinks. And I always try and bring this back to the biological idea to keep that metaphysical grounding. And you might think, well, hold on. Plenty is exempt from that game, right? It's not like if two human beings decide to have a baby, they're not going to have a baby from a different species. So there's the idea, surely there, the biological idea is very constrained. But that's not really the way to think about it, because you've already imposed a limitation by looking at two organisms from a particular species. The way to think about this is the biological idea is not restricted to human beings. The biological idea is life itself. And when you think about that, then there is no limitation, because looking at it kind of like from an evolutionary perspective, there is no limitation to what can be actualized from this biological idea, as the diversity of species testifies to. So anyway, the divine game, nothing's exempt from it. It affirms the whole of chance. And then he also says the different throws are formally but not numerically distinct. So they're not numerically distinct because prior results are included. It's not a brand new start every time. So there is a connecting thread linking the prior results, but they're formally distinct because each throw entails different rules. Each throw can bring about different connections, can find different relations within the different elements within the idea. So there is, so it's not numerically distinct, but formally distinct. And this he describes as the game of the problematic and the imperative. Problematic meaning that it leads to concrete solutions. This is how I understand it. And imperative and I guess really just meaning that this is required. This is the way reality works. This is how this is how concrete realities come about. And this game, as opposed to the human game, which was the same and representation, the divine game is difference and repetition. And that would be a perfect place to finish this video. But we're not going to finish there. We have to keep going because we've still got to look at the other structure as well. So the other structure, why does Deleuze call this structure the other? The reason is the other is not you or I, because it's you and I, depending on the different perceptual, this is what Deleuze says, the different perceptual worlds that we might inhabit, or the different perspectives we might bring to the situation. So the other isn't a particular person or thing, rather, and that's why we're using this word structure, the other structure, because it's not particular, but it's not even a particular structure. Rather, it's a structure which grounds and ensures the overall functioning of this world as a whole. So it's not a particular structure within the world, because it's the structure which allows the world to be the world, which allows particular structures within the world to appear as particular structures. So it's that foundational, that it can't be just another particular structure. It's a structure, so it's not a particular individual, but it's deeper than a regular structure, because it's that structure which allows normal structures, particular structures to appear. Notions necessary for the description of this world, such as those of form, ground, profile, unity of the object, depth, length, horizon, focus, would remain empty and inapplicable if the other were not there to give expression to those possible worlds in which that which is, for us, in the background is perceived or subperceived as a possible form, that which is in depth as a possible length, etc. In short, it is the other structure that ensures individuation within the perceptual world. It is not the I nor the self. On the contrary, these need this structure in order to be perceived as individualities. Everything happens as though the other integrated the individuating factors and pre-individual singularities within the limits of objects and subjects, which are then offered to representation as perceivers or perceived. So this way of thinking about the other is, we can say, transcendental, because it's necessary for the encounter with the empirical. It grounds the empirical, and in that sense it's transcendental in Deleuze's, the way Deleuze uses that word. But it's also what I would call metaphysical, because it's a structuring framework. It's a part of the way it emerges, if you like, from the way that reality has to be. Reality, the fundamental nature of reality. The fact that there are things, the fact that we see things and know things and understand things, tells us that those things must be appearing. And in order for those things to appear, this deeper truth must be the case. And that is what I call metaphysical. So transcendental in opposition to the empirical, metaphysical in opposition to the physical, grounding the physical. So anyway, the quote itself, the other presupposes, this was an interesting point from there, the other presupposes fields of individuation, which are in the idea, while being the condition for things themselves in explicated reality. And that's basically what I think that quote is capturing, the way that the other, as the structural feature of reality, makes possible the empirical reality that we live in, that we engage with. And this really isn't that surprising, because the other structure, if you think about it, is essentially difference. How else can you think about it except in terms of difference? So just another connection back to this fundamental idea for Deleuze, difference. Okay, so let's have a look at the second and last part of the video today, repetition. There are three types of repetition, and I'll just briefly run through these. Again, this is just a summary of what we've talked about in much more detail already. So the first type is habitus, and this is a repetition of instants. It's a superficial repetition of the identical and instantaneous external elements that are contracted into wholes. We talked about this in the body of the book with regards to Hume and Bergson, actually. Habitus is sub-representative, so beneath the level of representation, and difference in this first repetition is drawn from the elementary repetitions being contracted into those passive selves. Then the second type of repetition is Mnemosyne, or memory, and this was a repetition of the past. It was a profound, Deleuze called it the profound as opposed to the superficial repetition of totalities coexisting on different levels or degrees, and we represented this with the analogy with Bergson's cone, Bergson's metaphor of the cone. And these different levels or degrees are also contracted. So contraction plays an important role in both the first and the second repetition. Difference appears in Mnemosyne as between the levels, which include their own singularities or privileged points, we called them. And Deleuze goes on to say here that difference itself occurs also between the first and the second repetition. So he calls those two the two faces of repetition. Sorry, the two faces of difference. And I've got a quick quote for you. The material repetition results from the more profound repetition, which unfolds in depth and produces it as an effect, like an external envelope or a detachable shell, which loses all meaning and all capacity to reproduce itself once it is no longer animated by the other repetition, which is its cause. The secret repetition surrounds itself with a mechanical and bare repetition. And this is a kind of a tricky idea. So the second repetition is the cause of the first. And this is not at all the way we went through it in the beginning of the book, where we looked at the first repetition of habit as bringing about time, if you like. The first kind of appearance of time into the world through these instants which are contracted into these little holes, these little passive selves. And then the second repetition built on that. And that's kind of the metaphysical picture. But the reason I think Deleuze says here the second repetition is the cause of the first, so without the profound repetition of the past, you don't have this superficial repetition of the instance. The reason for that, I think, is because the second is where you first get a mind, where mind first comes into it, with memory. With memory, you first get the what can be understood as an actual mind, as a thinking being, conscious being. Whereas the first repetition lacks that. The first repetition lacks this mindedness. So it's not, and what I mean by that then is that it's not happening for anybody. It's just the natural interplay of the universe. It's just the universe unfolding, but it's not happening for anyone. So it's just forces, if you like, taking place. But it's with memory. Once memory comes about, then the first repetition appears for the first time as a repetition. Prior to that, it was just the universe doing what the universe does. Just reality doing what reality does. But then once you have memory, now reality means something. That first repetition can appear with the meaning, first repetition, with a sense. The second repetition is the first time that sense comes into being. And with sense, that spreads over everything that's happened. And so things now acquire meaning. And that's what I think he's getting at here when he says the material repetition results from the more profound repetition, not in a kind of linear sense, not in the sense that you need the second repetition in order for the first to happen. It's that without that second repetition, it's meaningless to talk of a first repetition. There is no such thing as repetition prior to that. There's no such thing as non-repetition. There's just no such thing at all. So that's how I understand that. And then we have the third kind of repetition, which is Thanatos. So when the second repetition inspires the first covers over the second repetition, and the ground which was memory, sinks back into representation of what it grounds, where repetition plays out according to the same. So once you have this profounder repetition of memory, then representation takes over. And when we think about the process, all we see is the superficial representation, the mechanical representation. The superficial repetition, the mechanical repetition of habitus. And so we think there's nothing special here, or it's purely physical, cause and effect. We reduce it to this kind of model, a model that takes its cue from the same and resemblance. So the question for Deleuze here then is how to avoid this, the way that the ground sinks into representation of what it grounds and is therefore lost. How can we avoid this and recover a genuine repetition? And his answer is by going beyond the grounded and the grounding, the first and the second repetition, to the ungrounding. That is the death instinct. And this is just time. Remember, the death instinct is death, not because of any kind of physical death, but time empty and out of joint with its rigorous formal and static order. We described it as that crushing unity and that irreversible series. So we're going beyond the first and the second repetitions to to the death instinct, and that's groundless. We're taking away the ground. In the sense that, and we talked about this in the last video, the sense that the ground rises up again, but without the form, without form being imposed on it. So it's now malleable, if you like. It's pliable. We can do something with it. We can use it. It's structural. That's what the third repetition is. That's what time is for Deleuze. It's a structuring dimension, if you like. It brings order to a human life so that something can be done with it. Something can be made out of it. And that's what he says about difference. Difference was drawn from the elementary repetitions which are contracted in the first repetition. It appears between the different levels in Bergson's cone in the second repetition, and difference in the third repetition is made, Deleuze says. This is that unpredictable creativity which results from the fact that the third synthesis is just a structuring feature in human lives. And they're structured. How are they structured? Temporally. So they're structured with this temporal dimension which lets us do things with our lives, which brings some coherence to our lives. So he talks about the first repetition as the sad repetition of habit. That's kind of a negative way to think about it. But anyway, sad repetition of habit. The second is the profound repetition of memory, and the third is the ultimate repetition of death. And that's probably a pretty good place to finish. So let's wrap up there and have a look at a summary. First up was ideas, and ideas are multiplicities constituted of differential elements, differential relations, and singularities. And this corresponded to the aspects, those three aspects of multiple reason, determinability, reciprocal determination, and complete determination. Then we looked at incarnation and actualisation. And the idea here was that incarnation takes place in the idea, in those fields of individuation, and then actualization is what brings about concrete reality, actualized into species and parts. Then we looked at differentiation versus differenciation, ideas being determined in the virtual, which is differentiation, and then actualized through differenciation. And connected with this was the notion of distinct and obscure, or distinct obscure. And the idea here is that ideas exist in a state of indifferentiation, which is nevertheless perfectly differentiated. So there's a complete determination within the idea, even though it's undifferentiated, but when it's differentiated or actualized, then there is the differentiation within the idea is covered over. So you always have the duality there is distinctness and clarity. The more distinctness you have, the less clarity in the idea. The more clarity, the less distinct. Then we looked at problems, and these were a state of the world, so kind of a metaphysical way of thinking about them, not subjective, not provisional. They are a fundamental way that reality is, and it must be in order for things to happen. In order for there to be things at all, we need this prior state of problems. Then we looked at the origin of ideas and explored this through the metaphor of a divine game in contradistinction to a human game. And basically in divine games, there are no rules, or the rules are made up every time. The rules are invented with every new move, with every new turn, with every new throw of the dice. And each throw embodies the whole of chance. So there are no restrictions here. It's endless, limitless potential. Then we looked at the other structure, and this is a structure because it's nothing particular. It's not tied to anything specific. The other structure is necessary for the existence of a world. And when Deleuze talked about those pairings, form, ground, profile, unity, and so on. And the other structure is required for that. And it essentially, at its most basic form, it's another way of thinking difference. And in fact, many of the things that we've talked about today and the things that Deleuze talks about are different ways of thinking difference, but it all comes back to that fundamental idea. Then we looked at repetition in the second part of the video, and those three repetitions: habit, memory, and death. The first is the sad repetition, the second is the profound repetition, and the third, the ultimate repetition. And difference in each of these cases: with habit, difference was drawn from the elementary repetitions. It appeared between the levels in the profound repetition, and it was made in the ultimate repetition. And that's us for the second part of the conclusion. Hopefully that helped. In the next video, we will wrap up, finally. I'm kind of looking forward to just knocking this one out and leaving it. I've done difference and repetition. It's all I've been thinking about when it comes to these YouTube videos for so long. I'm looking forward to wrapping it up. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.